What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so with all new, all different amazing Spider-Man, Power Play is one of these stories that's really interesting because this really deals with like Spider-Man versus Iron Man in like every conceivable way. It's like they fight and like they're fighting over Mary Jane Watson and they're fighting over like whose company is the best. They physically fight. It's but at the end of the day, this also deals with the idea of the return of Augustus Roman. And again, we'll talk more about him, once we get to that little section. We'll deal with that in relation to the whole idea of the Secret Wars Spider-Man Renew Your Vows story. But with regards to this Power Play story, one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this really comes out of All New, All Different Invincible Iron Man, the first couple volumes with Tony Stark. And the way this had worked out is Brian Michael Bendis was writing two Iron Man stories at the same time. There was All New, All Different Invincible Iron Man, then there was All New, All Different International Iron Man. Invincible Iron Man dealt with Tony Stark and his company and so on and so forth. International Iron Man kind of picked up in the middle of Invincible Iron Man. And what it basically revealed is Tony Stark's realization that his parents were not his actual parents. I mean, he'd known that for a little while, but it continued the story in the sense of the fact that he was basically hunting for his biological mother. Now, International Iron Man dealt with him tracking her down, locating her, talking to her, that kind of a thing, inviting her to be a part of his life. The issue was, within the realm of the Invincible Iron Man line of stories, Tony Stark had basically just kind of pitched Mary Jane Watson to become a member of his team, to basically work for him, just because of the fact that the nightclub that she had ran for so long had basically been destroyed. Now, that was the whole idea of Marvel sort of soft rebooting the character of Mary Jane Watson, in the sense that for years and years and years, she was involved in like modeling. And then eventually she, took up the idea of running a nightclub. But going through All New, All Different Marvels, Secret Wars, all that kind of good stuff, the idea was to refresh her and to basically move her away from that. And the idea is that she initially turned down the offer to work for him, only for Iron Man's AI Friday to basically approach Mary Jane Watson and say, look, you have to stall. Because with Tony Stark going on a mission to find James Rhodes prior to his death leading into Civil War II, Tony Stark was basically absent from his company. And the result was that the Board of Trustees tried to take it over. But with Mary Jane Watson stepping in and basically saying, I've been appointed the head of Stark Industries by Tony Stark himself in his absence, what it now meant is that there was somebody running the company. And so the Board of Trustees really had no recourse anymore. And so Mary Jane Watson effectively worked for Tony Stark. Now, the reason why this matters is because moving to this sort of gala that's being held, in New York City by Peter Parker on behalf of Parker Industries, what this does is it brings in his company. Now, with regards to Parker Industries, there's no real explanation that's offered in terms of how it was that it got so big outside of the small little tidbits that, Marvel drops here and there. In the events before All New, All Different Marvel, Parker Industries was a company that had been created by Superior Spider-Man, Dr. Octopus. The issue with this is that between the time that Parker Industries was formed and the start of All New, All Different Marvel, basically 8 months had passed. And so we're just kind of left to believe that there were a lot of different innovations and new technologies that were made by Parker or by Peter Parker that led to Parker Industries becoming a multinational corporation. And that's really it. There's really no story that's like, here's how Parker Industries got as big as it is. All we know is that when All New, All Different Marvel kicked off, Parker Industries is, for the most part, in a lot of ways, more successful than Stark Industries. And so again, it was kind of a cool scenario. But the funny thing about this is that during this gala, this is the first time that Peter Parker learns that Mary Jane Watson's basically working for Tony Stark. And it's kind of a funny scenario because remember, Mary Jane Watson is one of like the few people in the entirety of the Marvel Universe who know that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Not only that, remember, they have a very, very long history with one another. Because of the events of One More Day, when Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson were supposed to get married, Peter Parker ended up being late or something along those lines, and so that never happened. But with the exception of their marriage, everything that took place before that is still in continuity. It's still intact. Now, the relationship has been a little bit tumultuous over the years because of the fact that they didn't get married. There is kind of a romantic interest. They've talked about it a little bit, but never actually acted on it. But the idea remains they're still two of the closest people when it comes to, how they relate to one another, their ability to confide in one another, different things like that. And so one of the other things that's kind of hit on here is that when it comes to Peter Parker, over the course of the 8 months that took place prior to the release of All New, All Different Amazing Spider-Man #1, Parker Industries dominated his time. And the result was that he hasn't really been able to spend as much time with the people that he cares about as he normally would. And so again, it kind of creates a weird situation because where Peter Parker is the face of Parker Industries, the question becomes, what does he do when he has to be Spider-Man? Now, in this story, it's largely going to be Peter Parker Spider-Man. It's really going to be him just being Spider-Man. But under normal circumstances, when it comes to somebody having to play the role of Spider-Man, we actually are introduced to a character named Hobie Brown, who used to go by the name Prowler, the Prowler of the main Marvel Universe. But the idea here is that Prowler would basically just act out as the role of Spider-Man, so that if Peter Parker were hosting a press conference, you'd be able to see Peter Parker and Spider-Man in two different places at the same time. So it would basically just throw off suspicion and nobody would be aware of what it was that's going on. The other half of this equation is Harry Osborn. Historically speaking, despite the fact that he's constantly, kind of reinvigorated himself, Harry Osborn having played the role of the Green Goblin at one point, the idea was that Harry Osborn had basically left that entire life behind and changed his last name from Osborn to Lyman to basically, go by his mother's maiden name. But the goal was to basically walk around and say, my name is Harry Lyman, not Harry Osborn, and so the stigma of his legacy would not be stuck around him anymore. Now, for those individuals who knew Norman Osborn personally, people who had dealt with Norman Osborn during the events of Dark Reign, for example, just because of the fact that Harry has the same hairstyle, they immediately know that Harry and Osborn are son and father, respectively. But the other idea here is that they also realize that Harry's trying to turn over a new leaf, and in fact, he's actually working for Peter Parker at the moment, which is still kind of cool. Now, the other half of this is what goes on with the idea of like Augustus Roman and Spider-Man 2099 and, Liz from Alchemax Prison and all those different things. And so starting with Augustus Roman, one of the things that I want to point out here is that as he appears here in this story, he's totally different from the Augustus Roman that you probably read about when it came to Renew Your Vows during Secret Wars. The Augustus Roman that appeared in that story and is part of the ongoing Renew Your Vows story is a totally different universe. That's what that is. It's a whole different reality. It's totally separate from what we're seeing right here. But in the original Renew Your Vows story, Augustus Roman had basically gone through and captured and or killed almost all the superheroes that he came across and then basically siphoned those powers into himself. And so it was like a one-man wrecking machine. He had all the powers of all the superheroes that he's ever captured, for the most part, all the superheroes who had ever existed. So all these different powers are basically combined into himself. And what he did is he basically went forward calling himself the Regent, turned New York City into a police state of sorts, and of course it led to Spider-Man, Mary Jane Watson taking Augustus Roman down. What this does is it basically presents the scenario where we see almost the exact same event unfolding, but through different means. So that's what makes it sort of interesting here. Now, the other half is really Liz Allen from Alchemax. One of the stories that I've been kind of teetering on, that I've been experimenting on the idea of covering, has been Spider-Man 2099. And the idea of Spider-Man 2099 is that it deals with a character named Miguel O'Hara who traveled back to the past, or really was kind of stuck in the past, but the goal was to keep Alchemax from coming to fruition, because Alchemax ends up being turned into this massive conglomerate of a company that's basically corrupt and runs all these experiments and is more or less the arch nemesis of Spider-Man 2099. And so what he'd been doing is he'd been going into the past and trying to find a way to keep that from happening. Now, Alchemax is by no means an important part of this story, but it is something that I thought was worth mentioning and kind of talking about. Again, that would be something that we would have far more of a conversation about if we were to cover Spider-Man 2099. It's central to that story, and there's really no way to avoid it. But with regards to this little bit of a story, we end up having just this like D-list villain named Ghost show up on the scene and start wreaking havoc. And here's the funniest thing about this. This is why I love this story so much. In the middle of this fight, both Tony Stark and Peter Parker don their costumes and immediately start going against Ghost. But in the middle of it, they start arguing over who it is that gets to defeat Ghost. That's how you know you suck when you're a villain. Not because you have crappy powers, but because the heroes you're facing off against are arguing over which ones defeated you the most, or which one you actually belong to, like which superhero is supposed to be fighting you. I mean, they're not even worried about this guy. And that's kind of the crazy thing. They're just kind of like, dude, we have more important things to worry about than you. Like, we have things to worry about, like which one of us has beat you the most. And that's kind of the funny scenario here, because while all that's going on, Augustus Roman's kind of knocked unconscious. But one of the funny things here is we actually see him commenting and is really kind of disappointed in what's going on with Spider-Man and Tony Stark, in the sense that they're spending more time arguing than they are actually, dealing with the supervillain in question. Now, of course, Ghost is taken out pretty fast, and that's really about it. But getting into the whole idea of Augustus Roman, we basically learned that his wife was essentially killed in a massive superhero battle. And so what had basically taken taken place here is that Augustus Roman had launched Empire United for the purpose of going through and capturing all these different supervillains. Now, like, it's not like Augustus Roman goes around and says, yes, I am here to capture these guys and then steal their powers. He basically puts it on as a front that he's there for the purpose of creating like a supermax prison that nobody can gain access to. Now, again, we've seen that like a multitude of times in Marvel Comics. One of the most popular versions of that was a place called the Raft, and the Raft was literally a giant supervillain prison, and it was replaced off and on by different prisons. But in this instance, Augustus Roman looks at the superhero community and considers them to be failures in a lot of different ways because they spend more time arguing and bickering. They don't really, solve major crises. And so his goal is to basically take the powers of every superhero and then bring those powers unto himself and be the only superhero that anybody needs. So in a lot of ways, his motivations are almost identical to the alternate reality version of Regent that we saw during the Secret Wars event. But at the same time, everything still pretty much comes out the same in the sense that Augustus Roman, is able to stop this massive tanker explosion. He's able to defeat the guy that, led to this tanker assault in the first place, some Atlantean. I mean, that's really about it. But he starts making a name for himself in the sense that he's basically the new kid on the block. He's the new villain out there. People are looking up to him. People are recognizing what it is that he's capable of. But it's also drawn the attention of different people, like Spider-Man is really kind of looking into it to a degree. Harry Osborn more so than anything else, just because Harry's kind of enamored with everything that's unfolding and everything that's going on. But the other half of this is that almost immediately, Harry Osborn comes to the realization that Augustus Roman is Regent. And that's the whole idea, is that, Augustus Roman's trying to keep his identity hidden in a lot of different ways. But in the background, what this does is it basically leads to, Betty Brant, and it leads to Mary Jane Watson, and it leads to Harry Osborn concocting their own plan of sorts for the purpose to basically, figure out what's going on with Regent, what's going on, all these powers that he has and these different abilities and so on and so forth. And so the cool thing about this is that in the middle of this whole situation, we actually have Peter Parker traveling over to visit Miles Morales. And again, when it came to All New, All Different Marvel, the Ultimate Universe was basically done away in the lead up to Secret Wars. And so there really is no more Ultimate Universe per se. Now, Marvel's been talking about bringing a lot of the Ultimate Universe characters back, but as far as we know, there's simply just the Prime Marvel Universe, and that's it. I mean, there's other realities, but they don't really focus on those too much. Miles Morales, following the events of Secret Wars, was basically rolled into the Marvel Prime Universe, and then has just kind of been operating as Spider-Man alongside Peter Parker. The issue with this is that in the middle of him basically bailing out on Peter Parker and Iron Man bickering amongst each other once again, he's immediately captured by Regent. Now, this is a pretty big deal, and the reason why is because, as we discussed in my video on Miles Morales, in a lot of ways, he's a little more capable and a little more powerful than Peter Parker. Peter Parker has experience under his belt. He's been at this a lot longer than Miles Morales has, and so that experience will constantly compound. The only way that Peter Parker will really end up falling short of Miles Morales is if Peter Parker just retired for a really long time, or if Miles somehow gained all new abilities that Peter Parker just doesn't have. But for the most part, the core powers remain the same, a spider sense of sorts, the ability to crawl on walls, different things like that. But for Miles, he has things like the ability to make himself invisible, the ability to administer a kind of venom touch whenever he makes contact with somebody that administers a kind of electric shock. But the reason why this matters is because with the powers of Miles Morales, by copying him and then basically mimicking his abilities, it allows Augustus Roman to begin the process of tracking down all these different superheroes. Because think about it, Miles Morales has his own friendship with like Kamala Khan and with Nova, Sam Alexander, a lot of these superheroes who would trust him, that he can send distress signals out to if he needs to. It allows Augustus Roman, acting as Miles Morales, to infiltrate places that he wouldn't normally be able to get in. Now remember, it doesn't mean that like Augustus Roman takes on the form of Miles Morales, not at all. He doesn't shapeshift. At the moment, he just has the power to make himself invisible, crawl on walls, which is how he's able to take out Kamala Khan. But because Kamala Khan can shapeshift, and because she can increase her size, he now gains those abilities. So Sam Alexander's ability to manipulate cosmic forces, Captain America Sam Wilson's ability to, see through the eyes of birds and the vision, all these individuals are all basically captured by Augustus Roman. Now, ultimately, the big major fight really comes against Thor. And under normal circumstances, Augustus Roman would not stand a chance against Jane Foster. But it's not just Augustus Roman, it's Augustus Roman and all the powers that he's captured so far. And so it would be like if Jane Foster were fighting against like Spider-Man Peter Parker and Iron Man and Captain America and all these different characters all at the exact same time, then it would create a wildly difficult situation. And so ultimately, we end up having, Harry Osborn calling a meeting with Augustus Roman. And this is actually a cool little bit of detective work that goes on here, just because of the fact that Harry Osborn basically says, hey, look, we wanted to go ahead and have this joint venture between, Empire United and Parker Industries to have you guys guys, continue the process of building a prison to, for us to basically fund you guys. We want to keep this joint venture going. But really, it's actually Harry Osborn kind of pulling a ruse on Augustus Roman. And the reason for this is because of the fact that with his webware technology, which is one of these small little devices that Parker Industries makes, not only does it allow him to send out distress signals, it also allows him to track individuals who are also wearing these little pieces of technology. And that's when he uses the scenario of Betty Brant, who was sent to infiltrate Empire United and figure out if Augustus Roman really was Regent. It leads Harry Osborn to realize that Augustus Roman had basically taken her and done whatever it was that he did with her. And so the result is that, of course, when everybody's trying to track down Augustus Roman, these various superheroes who have suddenly come up missing, it leads to Harry Osborn tipping off Peter Parker and Iron Man and Mary Jane Watson and so on and so forth. And so, of course, they respond. But one of the other things that I also want you to notice here is that among the various superheroes that, Augustus Roman has captured includes characters like Deadpool, Rogue, Daredevil, and Hyperion, and so on and so forth. And so the question that has to be asked is, when were these guys captured? The issue is that I don't think we're actually given a definitive time. I think we're just kind of left to believe that it takes place between the various stories of a lot of these different characters. And so that's one of the issues that you kind of run into when it comes to Marvel at the moment, is that a lot of the continuity just kind of seems to be out of place. There's no definitive answer to when this happens. Now, in truth, most people wouldn't have a reason to ask that question in the first place. Most people wouldn't really have a reason to say, well, when does this story take place? They would just kind of say, okay, these heroes were captured somewhere along the line, and that's really about it. But the overarching goal that was trying to really be hit on by Dan Slott here was that it was going to be a repeat of the whole renew your vows scenario, when Augustus Roman basically incapacitates every single superhero and then copies their powers. Now, the reason why this is kind of important is because it was the idea that Regent was going to make his return. The problem with this is that in a lot of ways, people weren't really interested in seeing that. They kind of wanted to see a few more stories that were done that hadn't really been seen before. They wanted to see something fresh. And so what we actually ended up doing here in the tail bit of this story is we initially pick up with Mary Jane Watson sorting through and pilfering through all these different, Spider-Man suits that Peter Parker's worn over the years, these Iron Man suits that Tony Stark's worn over the years, and eventually she comes across the Iron Spider suit. Now, the Iron Spider suit was a really, really cool piece of technology that was made by Tony Stark for Spider-Man during the events of the first Civil War. And the idea was that if Spider-Man was basically going to join Iron Man in the cause of the Superhuman Registration Act, then Spider-Man was going to both be rewarded, but also be provided with technologies that would allow him to basically deal with those insurgent superheroes, Captain America and his Secret Avengers, for example. And so the Iron Spider outfit allowed Peter Parker to change his physical appearance. It had these appendages that came out of the back. It had all kinds of different, little technologies and tidbits and so on. And the cool thing was that it basically allowed for a new design for the Spider-Man outfit. The problem is that it was contextual. It was one of those things that Marvel couldn't keep around forever. It was basically contingent on the popularity of Civil War. And as soon as the Civil War event began to wear down, and then eventually we went into, Secret Invasion and Dark Reign and Siege and all those different stories, ultimately, the Iron Spider armor just kind of became a thing of the past. But the cool thing about this is that it tells us that Peter Parker still has it sitting around. He might wear it during some major conflict. We don't really know. In this particular instance, it's just like Augustus Roman, more or less facing off against Iron Man and Peter Parker at the same time. Now, of course, with Augustus Roman having like a spider sense and things like that, he can be alerted to damage or to incoming attacks, which is one of those interesting scenarios. Because to talk about this for a second, with Peter Parker's spider sense, it's one of the reasons why he's one of the more formidable characters that are out there, because his spider sense alerts him to incoming damage before that threat actually manifests. And so it basically always gives him the heads up on anybody that he's going to fight. If it were somebody who was crazy like the Flash, somebody who was so insanely fast, by the time Peter Parker's spider sense went off, it would probably be too late. He just wouldn't be able to react fast enough. But for somebody in the Marvel Universe who's a little slower, like Quicksilver, then there's a very good chance that Peter Parker would probably be able to cope, use the spider sense to his advantage. Against somebody like the Incredible Hulk, or somebody like Thor who's quick, but not necessarily as fast as like Quicksilver or something along those lines, Peter Parker is able to hold his own, because his spider sense will alert him if Thor's gonna hit him with the hammer, or if the Incredible Hulk is gonna try to smash him or something along those lines. And it's really just that one thing that sets Peter Parker apart from virtually everybody else. It's why whenever there's these massive events, Spider-Man's usually always the last man standing, because his spider sense is what allows him to stay a step ahead of whoever it is that he's facing off against. But with Mary Jane Watson arriving in the Iron Spider outfit, what it does is it offers Peter Parker a reprieve, a bit of a distraction that lets him travel back to Empire United and basically just begin the process and going in and breaking all these different containment cells and freeing all these different superheroes, which means that by the time Peter Parker's done, Augustus Roman has to face off against like Colossus, Kamala Khan, and like Vision and Hyperion and Thor and Iceman and so on and so forth, which we don't really see that conflict happen. Instead, it takes face-off panel, which is kind of disappointing. But the fact remains, with Augustus Roman basically being defeated, the story more or less ends with the idea of Peter Parker making more time for all the friends that he has. You know, Robbie Robertson meeting with like Betty Brant, you know, one of his longtime friends, his first love interest actually, to meet with all these different members of his life that have played a significant role. But all of this was designed to set the stage for the clone conspiracy. And the reason why is because in the middle of all this, Aunt May's current husband, J. Jonah Jameson Sr., ends up coughing up blood, with the indication being that he's effectively dying. And so what this does is it sets the stage for Dead No More, the story that basically deals with the idea of clones, the return of the Jackal, or at least the person we believe to be the Jackal, ultimately going into the whole idea of the main clone conspiracy story itself, which we'll cover that stuff this week. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.